First of all, Mr. Jerry Diaz, thank you so much for joining us today. There are many topics we would like to address during this interview, namely the recently announced investment in the production of electric vehicles in Ontario, also a bit of Unifor's history, and of course, as we are a Portuguese-Canadian media outlet, we would also like to talk about your Portuguese origins and connections. But first of all, let's begin by talking about the investment in electric vehicles. So we know that the federal and the Ontario governments announced that they will each spend 295 millions to help Ford Canada mass produce electric vehicles in Oakville. So what was Unifor's role in this agreement?
Well, we went into contract negotiations with Ford Motor Company, and we selected Ford Motor Company instead of Fiat Chrysler and General Motors, because we thought that Ford Motor Company had the best vision for what it was we were trying to accomplish here in Canada. Prior to the deal that we negotiated with Ford, over $300 billion globally had been announced for electric vehicle production, and not one nickel was in Canada. And we know today that about 3% of the global market is electric vehicles, but we know by 2040, it'll probably be about 50%. And if we were not successful in negotiating an investment now, there was a very, very strong probability that we'd be left out for the future. So our role was to negotiate with Ford Motor Company. And then after we negotiated the agreement, we met with the governments and spoke to the governments about how they were going to contribute. So it was really the first time in, I will argue, decades, that the federal, provincial governments, the corporations, unions, we all got together and we figured out a real solution that will benefit working people for a long time. So I'm feeling very good about it.
Mm-hmm. So is this cooperation between the federal government and the Ontario government somehow surprising for you?
Well, yes, because historically, when it comes to the auto industry, even though it's the number one export manufacturing industry in this country, the cooperation, that you would expect just really hasn't happened. So I think that today, based on the challenges of COVID-19, the discussion about the greening of the economy, the discussions about what's the economy going to look like post-COVID, I think all of a sudden governments are putting aside their politics and really having discussions about what are the real solutions. So we had the same discussion with Fiat Chrysler, where the governments are going to put in over $500 million as we put in another assembly line to build battery electric vehicles in Windsor as well. So within the last month, we've negotiated electric vehicles for Oakville. We've negotiated electric vehicles in Windsor. And today I'm in contract negotiations with General Motors, and who knows how that's going to end up.
Mm-hmm. Some might say that the auto industry is a bit scared of this green revolution that is happening and this transition to electrical vehicles. Is this true? And if yes, do you think that people need to change their mentalities?
No, I don't think they're afraid of it at all. I mean, I think they are cognizant of the amount of investments it's going to take to go from internal combustible engines to battery electric vehicles. It's going to be significant. And that's why you're seeing the corporations that, by and large, have been mortal enemies, because their competitors are now talking about how do we combine our talents? How do we offset some of the significant costs? So there's a general understanding that, just hoping that electric vehicles will go away, that's not an option. So if you're going to be around for the long term, then you have to play. And so there's no misunderstanding in their mind. I spent a lot of time talking to the heads of the major auto companies globally, and they all get it. So it's not a question of fear, it's a question about how do you get to the finish line. And I think that's the preoccupation with them today.
Okay. Would you say that this investment will somehow have a positive impact on the Portuguese community in Canada?
Well, it certainly will, as it relates to our Portuguese members that work in the assembly plants, but it's not just the assembly plants, it's the auto parts. And if you take a look at many of the, if you look at the contribution that that, Portuguese Canadians have made, it's not restricted to manufacturing. So there's so many other industries, there's so many other, roles that we have played. So it'll benefit all Canadians, I will argue, regardless of nationality, regardless of origin.
So, but as we are speaking about the Portuguese people, I would like to talk a bit about your Portuguese origins. You have a very, very Portuguese surname, Dias. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, we are several generations from British Guyana, which is now just Guyana. If you're going back generations, a lot of Portuguese left Portugal, went to what was called British Guyana at the time, British colony, and they were the businessmen. So for example, my grandfather on my father's side, he owned a tug business, and they ran lumber. And if you go back historically of the Diases in Guyana, they really were entrepreneurs. So we are going back many, many generations to the point where my parents don't speak Portuguese because it was British Guyana and it was the British education system. And the reason that my parents emigrated to Canada was because Canada was a part of the British Commonwealth. So it was easier for my parents to emigrate here to Canada than it was to the United States. So we are very proud of our Portuguese roots. Like, look at me. Like, I've got your olive skin, the black hair. I'm about as Portuguese as you get. So we're proud of our heritage, but yes, we're proud Portuguese Canadians.
Of course. Do you somehow keep your connections with Madeira, right? Because your father was originally from Madeira.
Well, my great grandfather was. So we're
your great grandfather. Yes, sorry, of course.
Yeah, many generations. So we still have some, families that go back, second, third cousins. So there's still a large Guyanese footprint, obviously, and with a name like Dias, it's huge in Portugal. So there's no question we still have our connections, but Portugal is a place where I'm planning on spending significant time when I retire in 2 years from now, because the times that I've been, it's just beautiful. The cultures, the food, the people are, to me, the most kind in the world.
People.
Yes.
In Portugal, there are many benefits for retired people, so I'm sure it's a good destiny. From what I read, I also understood that it was your father that led you to the union's activity and finally to Unifor, right? Can you also tell us a bit about that?
Sure. My father emigrated to Canada about 65 years ago. And he ended up having a variety of different jobs in the manufacturing settings, but his main job was at the Havilland Aircraft, building, today they build a Dash 8, but back in those days they were building Twin Otters and they were building a whole host of different planes. So he became very active in the union in the late 50s, early 60s, and then became president of his local union in 1967, and then went on to the staff of the old UAW Canada back in 1978. What's interesting is that I became president of that same local union in 1987 and was the president for 7 years before I went on staff, which was then the UAW Canada became the Canadian Auto Workers Union. So Unifor, of which I am the president and proudly the first president of Unifor, is a little over 7 years old. And it's the merger of the Canadian Auto Workers and the Communication, Energy and Paper Workers Union. So we are the largest private sector union in the country. We have about 315,000 members representing workers in the 20 largest economic sectors of the country. So so my labor roots go deep, but my father, though he was an elected local union president and steward, my mother was also very, very active in her workplace. My mother ran a machine at WJ Gage, was very active in her union. So The bottom line is my mother, if you can imagine, belonged to the former Communication, Energy, and Paperworkers Union. My father belonged to the former Canadian Auto Workers Union. So it only makes sense that I'm the first president of the combined two unions.
Yes. I don't know if you know this number by heart, but do you know how many Portuguese workers Unifor represents?
No, I don't.
But the percentage, there are many?
It'll be significant. It may be 5%.
Okay. And what about collective agreements? How many does Unifor has accomplished? And
we have over 3,000 collective agreements in our union. So we renegotiate probably 1,000 collective agreements every year, which means every day about 3 collective agreements expire. Okay. So we are incredibly busy. We have our hands, on the pulse of the economy here in this country. We play a very active role. We play a very, very active role in communities. So we're proud of what it is we do.
What are the main sectors?
Oil and energy, auto, forestry, shipbuilding, airlines, hospitality, fish. I can start to walk right through it. Retail. We have members, if you can imagine, on strike today for almost 2 months in Newfoundland that work for Loblaws.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as you talk about that, what's your opinion about what's going on there?
I think that it's a fight between low-paid workers taking on an employer that makes billions. If you can imagine, Loblaws is owned by Galen Weston. His net worth is about $8.5 billion, personal worth. He should be ashamed of himself because about 85% of his employees that work for him in Newfoundland make less than $15 an hour. 85% of them work part-time hours. So this is a company with the ability to do so much more, but it's about greed. And so when I hear the Westons, when Canadians talk about Westons as being this form of Canadian royalty, it makes me want to vomit, because those with such an important stead within this country should have a responsibility to Canadians. They are wealthy because of Canadians. They're wealthy because of our contributions. You think that they would have the decency to give some back. So just because you have money and just because you have status and incredible wealth doesn't mean that you're decent.
Okay, so would you say that it's more about greed, systemic racism, as some have said?
Look, it's about a lack of respect. When your company made over $1 billion in profits last year and is doing even better as a result of the COVID pandemic, you think that they would have the decency to pay better and understanding the importance of families and full-time jobs versus part-time jobs. Can you imagine? These workers received a $2 an hour pandemic pay, and it was taken away by Loblaws saying that everything was okay. Well, everything is not okay. We know that. We're in wave 2. There's so many workers who are suffering. If you take a look at the role that grocery store workers are playing during this pandemic, they really are the heroes. And so everybody knows that, except for Galen Weston. So I don't know how you can be so wealthy and theoretically so smart, yet be so ignorant.
Mm-hmm. You talked about the impacts of the pandemic. I imagine that it had deep impacts in Unifor's activity as well, right?
No question about it. We have so many of our members on layoff, so many industries that we do not know when they're going to be coming back. We represent workers in the airlines that are running at, 5 and 6% capacity. We represent workers in casinos, in hotels, in restaurants. I can start to walk through the numerous industries. Even our members that work, for example, in aerospace, people aren't buying planes. People aren't buying corporate jets. So we have so many members on layoff in so many different sectors. So the impact on families has been huge. The impact on communities has been devastating. So we are doing everything we can to work with our members doing whatever we can to make sure that we are a strong presence within the communities.
So let's talk a bit about immigration for now. Other unions, namely LIUNA, says that Canada should remain open to immigration, but many Canadians, and this was shown in a recent poll, are worried about the immigration level, especially because of the impacts of the pandemic. What's your opinion regarding this matter?
Well, first of all, we're all immigrants, except for the Indigenous communities here. So there's always a frustration with me when I hear the anti-immigration comments, because we're a nation that is vast in land, but small in population. So look, we have to be cognizant that we're living during a pandemic. So we're gonna have to do things safely. I think everybody understands that. So it really is about, bringing people into country and making sure that we do it in a very safe way. So nobody's debating that. But we need to be cognizant that as a nation, for us to get to the next level, we need more people here in Canada. And there's only one way of doing it. Like, I can never understand how we would have a temporary foreign worker program. The bottom line, if it's good enough for you to come to Canada, work in Canada, pay taxes in Canada, well, then you should have the right to stay here in Canada. So I feel very strongly about that. I can't understand how we can have a temporary foreign worker program where workers that are coming into Canada, that are working and contributing to society, somehow are governed by different labor standards. Do they not deserve the same health and safety protections as everyone else? Of course they do. So anyway, so I have my very strong feelings as it relates to immigration, as it relates to the role my parents and grandparents and others have paid. Look, I know if it wasn't for my parents immigrating to Canada, I wouldn't be sitting here today. I think about my assistants, I think about our team, I think about their backgrounds, I think about their history. So why shouldn't we allow others the same opportunities that we have? Like, if it wasn't for my parents coming here, would I be living in Mahika, which is an hour outside of Georgetown, where my father grew up? So when I go to Mahika and we give back to the community, like, it is an impoverished community. So I'm lucky. My parents had the courage to leave. And the only reason they did it was because of the kids. So why would I not want the same for others that I was able to enjoy? So for me, it's basic.
Mm-hmm. So I've asked all of my questions. Mr. Jerry Dias, I don't know if you want to leave a final message to our Portuguese Canadian audience.
Well, my final remarks is, like you, I am so proud of my heritage. I'm so glad of the incredible contributions that the Portuguese community has made to Canada. I live in Toronto. The Portuguese community here is vibrant. And look, we need to be proud of the role we play here in Canada, but we need to be incredibly proud of who we are. And we may have migrated to another country, but we've never, ever forgotten our Portuguese roots. And I would say that that's why we are caring and giving, hardworking, and frankly, we're eager to make a lasting impression. So thank you all for your time.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Jerry Dias, and stay safe.
Thank you.